Our next presentation is from Melanie Sarge.
Great. Hi everyone, I'm Melanie Sarge. I'm from the College of Media and Communication. I'm housed in the advertising department. And so I'm here to talk about communicating climate science to the public. And so my presentation is extremely broad. I decided to talk about one specific project, especially because I'm kind of new to the area of climate science. But I'm hoping that you see kind of some of my interest, and perhaps maybe I might match up or be a tool for many of you as you are doing your particular science. So what I'm interested in is the people, the public. So I'm interested in learning and understanding what knowledge they have, their opinions, their attitudes, their values that they hold, what motivations drive them, and their behaviors, and how these lead to the decisions that they make. And the underlying aim of understanding this about the public is in order to effectively communicate with them, right? And so communicating whether it's on an individual level, a community level, or a mass public arena as well. And so this type of effective communication I'm referring to, at least with my research, I work often with trying to successfully exert the influence of a message. The intended influence of the message specifically. And so trying to promote that public beneficial science information to the public in order to increase some type of opinion or public engagement. And so that's the underlying goal. My previous research is actually more focused on health communication. I worked with the HPV vaccine when it first came out, studying some communication revolving that messaging, as well as weight loss strategies for obesity. And so since coming to Tech, this is my second year at Tech, I came from Ohio State University. Since coming to Tech, I've become more and more interested in communicating environmental science. And so that's why this is kind of the beginnings of where my research is going to fit in the realm of climate communication research right now. And I'm not the only one, of course, interested in these aims and these goals. This is a worldwide initiative for communicating climate change. And the previous research that's been done has really helped me dive into this area. And specifically, I'm going to highlight two different initiatives that have kind of combined together to create one particular project. And this is the Six Americas project, and this has been done in combination with the a Yale project, as well as George Mason University. And so what they've done is they've utilized a business strategy, which is market segmentation, in order to identify different publics in a nationally representative sample, according to, basically they've identified these different segments according to not just simple demographics, but based on their beliefs, their climate beliefs, their behaviors, as well as their policy preferences. And so they've identified these publics. And essentially, this helps communication because it makes communication more manageable. And it makes understanding these publics manageable, as well as communicating with them more manageable. And so I think the research surrounding this is really lends itself well to at least some of my initial studies in trying to determine how these different segments vary on the selective exposure, which we'll talk about later, and their processing messages, which we'll talk about later. And so that's how these kind of, I wanted to highlight this research and tell you a little bit about it because it's going to influence my my next study. So the Six Americas. This is their most recent published research. It started in 2008, taking the sample of individuals, measuring their beliefs, behaviors, and policy preferences. And you'll see the different segment percentages, and there's a lot of different information you can find in the report for this on the Yale Project website. But essentially, to the left, you have the alarmed and the concerned. And this is where you get these more concerned individuals who desire action. They have a higher desire for action regarding mitigation or adaptation strategies for climate change. And then you have towards the right side, in the doubtful and the dismissive, this unconcerned group that actually somewhat to vary opposes any type of action. Right? And then in the middle, you've got this this disengaged and this cautious group, which this is our less issue engaged publics. They have they don't have strong opinions, if any opinions, and they don't spend a lot of time actually thinking about climate change. And so this is what they've identified for these different groups. And their initial goals and their initial research has been focused around two different type of advantages you can have with these segmentations. The first one that I'll mention is finding a common value. Finding a type of communication strategy and message that you can get across that is favorable among all these different groups, despite their various differences in beliefs and behaviors. And so this kind of, identifying this kind of common denominator here allows for, or lends itself well to more mass communication circumstances. And so, for instance, they found that talking about renewable energy is actually favorable among all of these different segments. And a public health frame, utilizing a public health frame, elicits emotions that are consistent with support for policy change. And so the public health frame, again, it had some favorable outcomes. And so that's some initial focus of this benefit, finding that common denominator. Now, the other benefit of the segmentation is to identify those differences among the groups. And this lends itself well to tailored communication, which is very effective and is great given Web 2.0 and all the different mobile devices that allow and really match up well with tailored communication. And so that's another benefit. And so to highlight kind of that benefit, some of their research is that they found that the doubtful and the dismissive groups, those far to right corners, actually showed a boomerang effect, and they showed anger, which decreased their support for policy when they saw the national security frame. Other groups have, other researchers not tied to the Six Americas, but have identified different groups, like for example, American evangelicals show that values predict more of their policy support and their risk assessments. Conservative versus liberal research shows that conservatives will be more exposed to conservative media, which decreases their trust in scientists, which then decreases their certainty of whether global warming is actually happening or occurring. And so there's been different research that has grouped these individuals and used this particular segmentation strategy to find out, essentially what these are doing is to find out how to frame a message, what you should say in the message that'll have the outcomes that you desire and avoid the outcomes that you do not want in a group, in a public. So that's what's focused on, that how to design that message. However, there's still concerns. I put the seriousness of the issue and this drop among 12 countries, for example, up because in terms of message design, the seriousness of an issue is something that can be somewhat manipulated based on a message. It's an outcome that's often a message outcome. And so there's still concerns that exist in getting people on board and trying to move that doubtful and dismissive segment to more of an alarmed and cautious segment that are concerned about this particular issue. And so I bring up this because, well, now we've got a lot of research telling us how to create these messages, what to say in these messages that'll make everybody happy or make tailored communication that's good. But why are we still not seeing the results? And it might just be a delay in results, but in terms of information, I think there's two different determinants that we have to, that basically serve as barriers, that my particular contribution hopes to overcome. And so these two information determinants that act as barriers to me is the message competition that exists out there, right? So there's a number of different competing messages fighting for the attention of these different segments so that perhaps these beneficial, correct, effective messages that are out there that have been tested and are effective are getting lost, right? They're not being seen by the people who need to see them. And the other circumstance is that these messages have been tested under forced exposure circumstances. And so, sure, the message works when they're actually shown to these different individuals, and these positive dependent outcomes happen, after they see this message. But in the real world, these great messages might be avoided, right? So they're not even seeing them. So sure, the outcome would happen if they would actually be exposed to them, but they're selectively not being exposed to them. Does that make sense? And so my research highlights this selective exposure paradigm. And my previous health research also does this as well. But it identifies in trying to, my previous health research is focused on resistance to health messages, so it makes a lot of sense for me to focus on resistance to climate science as well. And so selective exposure this paradigm just talks about the idea that when given these different media alternatives or information outlets that exist, all these different messages, you don't equally select them. You don't actually have these nice equal selections of information. They're biased. You're biased. So it's a biased selection where you're selecting and avoiding based on predispositions, personality traits, different environmental contexts, and so all of that matters. And so this initial research, there's only been sort of one type of research that's focused on, that looked at information search behaviors. And so it was just a self-report that says, I search for climate science information, like a 4-point scale or something like that, but it still used a type of segmentation based on risk perception, and it showed that some of these different risk perceptions can lead to self-report of searching for information. However, what type of information is still unknown. And so my type of research would give them this type of experimental situation still, so still somewhat constrained, but trying to have a representative picture of the different alternatives of media information and learning how the different segments differ in their selection, what they're choosing, and how much time they're spending with it. And in hopes that you can find those features or message elements that are theoretically driven to put into those messages to increase that likelihood to choose on it in the real world and likelihood that they would spend time spent with that message as well. Yeah, oh, 1 minute. Okay, and so the other aspect besides selective exposure is bias processing. And so our first study actually with Catherine Hale and Jeff Larson at Tennessee is looking at this type of bias processing, and we're using a Petty-Cacioppo type of approach, just looking back at the original type of studies to see if these segments differ in their likelihood to process heuristically versus systematically based on the format in which we show them either with multiple, based on the strength of the argument or the number of arguments that we're presenting in different climate change messages. And so trying to see if these different segments are more likely to heuristically process based on this message format or systematically process. And so both of these types of research on bias processing as well as bias selection have two different implications. The first, for selection, is trying to increase the appeal of the message so that whatever triggers we can make will, you could make in the message would make them less likely to avoid the messages we want them to actually be looking at, and more likely to increase their exposure of those messages as well. And then also either match the desired processing approach that we find of these different segments, or figure out what in the message we can enhance or change that might trigger the systematic processing that has been shown in previous research to lead to some of the positive outcomes. And so, thank you, and any questions?
Your slide that showed the 6 Americans.
Sure.
And you had the extreme, the poles of alarmed and then dismissive. And I wonder, I mean, you probably need a multi-dimensional, a z-axis or something, because that implies that this side, I mean, would just imply a lot of emotion and attention, and this side would be just go away. And I think that side is equally as alarmed.
Yes.
And their alarm is that it's some sort of global UN conspiracy to turn us all into, the term is gyrating jellyfish or something like that. Alice jellyfish. Some sort of mutant android thing. I mean, they really do believe, a lot of people argue with this.
So it should be a U-shape.
Yeah, it should be, because I think on that end, there's a lot of it, and there's just as much alarm. It's alarm that this is it's a contrived conspiracy.
Absolutely, and their research actually does show that they are motivated, but in a different way. Yes, absolutely. And so our unmotivated people are actually in the middle, so a U-shape to actually represent this would be actually very neat and understand that.
Can't you make a very reasonable decision to be in the cautious category?
What do you mean?
Can't you look at all the evidence and say, from what I've seen, I'm going to be cautious? And it's not, I don't care. It's that's what I really believe.
Oh, sure, absolutely, yes, yes. I mean, there's different reasons why these individuals are in these different areas, yeah. And I mean, the report's very interesting, and I have the link that you can read more information about these different segments. Yeah.
How different or how important is the type of messenger that provides the message versus the quality of the message they're providing? Because it seems that if you look across that scale, there's different issues with the messenger. And it doesn't matter what the quality is on the right, it's the messenger that's delivering the message.
Yeah, absolutely. The source matters a lot, and there's a lot of previous research on what type of source matters for, not necessarily tied to these segments, but tied to different groups, like liberals or conservatives, or American evangelicals. You know, there's different sources that matter that will increase the likelihood that they might start to even pay attention to a message. So what I would say with that is the source and the previous research based on the sources, that might be something that I would be most likely to manipulate in my experiments to see if that would increase the likelihood that they choose that message and then spend more time with that message and then see some of those outcomes that may have been shown.
See, it looks to me, which is very interesting, and I wonder if there's just not another element to this. You know, something happened after 2008. That's what it looks like for a lot of these. At least several of those lines all declined after 2008. Which means, I know you're studying the way individuals respond to messages and stuff, but there's something exogenous happening. And that may be 2008, there was a financial crisis around the world that put everybody much more concerned about jobs as opposed to quality of life issues like climate change, where it tends to fit in those post-materialist kinds of things for those who study public attitudes. And I wonder, you know, how you think, does that affect the way you might want to think about how you would design messages? Because there's obviously something else going on there.
Oh, absolutely.
In that temporal sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was just more of a heuristic to highlight the fact that still just more needs to be done. And, you know, I only mentioned for my determinants of what could be affecting this. It's just information determinants that I would do for message development. However, and I think you prove a good point, is that time comes into play as well as context. And so even at the time where economic issues might be, you know, of concern of individuals, a response where economic issues might not have been as great as public health frame at that particular time, well, it's important to replicate that, test, you know, based on the environmental climate, see if then that has now changed over time. And so the replication is really important as well as taking that into consideration. Absolutely.
One more question from Richard.
Yeah, for the last 50 years, there's been a lot of research done in the meteorological community, particularly severe storm forecasting, on how to construct the warning or watch message and how to measure the response and why people do or do not respond to, say, a tornado warning and so forth. And a lot of this has been frustrating, actually, but there may be some analogies here. And for example, choosing the words, whether to use the word global warming or say global climate pattern change or something like that. And so there might be, I don't know if you've looked at any of that research, but there's been a lot published in that area.
Oh, absolutely, yes, absolutely. And again, those are the type of different things that we would test in order to see if that would affect their selection and processing. Yeah, and how, maybe by group as well, so by segment as well.
As you can see, this type of research is relevant to almost anything you can think of, which is why it's so cool. It's probably even relevant to fish.